that's what we need to get back to.
You mentioned the polarization. It does seem to be at an all-time high, particularly at the Washington level. So how does an independent come in and be effective under those situations where you've got Democrats and Republicans each so entrenched in their positions? How could you hope to have an effect?
Well, I think by keeping the focus on the issues and what's right for America. I think what we see a lot is, even in the Republican camp, being that I'm conservative, I'll say that they tend to be more conservative. And no disrespect to the Democrats, but that tends to be the way that they lean. But they make choices that don't necessarily stand on those conservative values. And when I talk about conservative, I mean fiscally conservative, where John Boehner, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Boehner, I think is how I've heard it pronounced. Where a good conservative, Paul Ryan, had a budget that would eliminate a lot of the deficit by 2040. The Republican establishment chose not to support that because it took on entitlement spending. It's something that's, again, tends to create fear among senior citizens when we started addressing Social Security reform. And that's really pandering to that special interest group just to keep their job. And that's what I would do in Congress, is I would keep both sides focus on what's right for America, at least in my opinion, what we need to do and what direction we need to go. And I think that by just keeping that issue in the forefront, we'll get both sides to actually come together and work together to solve the problems for Americans.
From what I've read of your stances on issues, you believe the federal government has become too powerful. Give me some examples of how you see that, and how would you change it?
Well, I think too large and too powerful is a good way to represent where I stand. I think that a good example would be the Department of Education. I think that where I would look at that as an example is who is better to make a decision about our children's education. A functionary sitting in K Street in Washington, D.C., working for the Department of Education, or is it the local school board that's duly elected by the people of Tennessee and the parents of our children? I think that we need to look at education on a more locally focused basis and not necessarily the nationally driven initiatives that we've seen in the past, that have failed in the past.
Do you eliminate then the Department of Education? Is that what you're suggesting?
Not necessarily. Limit the size, obviously. I think that we could possibly move away from that, but I think that having a centralized Department of Education helps show or gives a better look at the big picture. It can help us focus in the right areas. But I don't think that, as we've seen in the past, the unfunded mandates like No Child Left Behind, they've failed because, again, it's the central government or the bigger government trying to mandate a overall, I won't call it a scheme, but an overall plan, where I think that we need to address education on a local level, and because there's specific problems in each local community, even in Tennessee. I think if we look at the amount of money that we spend on education, I think annually we spend in the ballpark of $500 billion annually, which amounts to about $10,000 per student. But then if we look at the graduation rates, take in Tennessee, for example, Tipton County spends in the ballpark of $7,500 per student, and they have a 90% graduation rate, whereas Memphis spends $10, $12, maybe $14,000 per student and has a 60, 70% graduation rate. So clearly there's no correlation between the amount of money spent and the graduation rates. We need to look at the local problems that each school district faces and address those problems to solve, I think, the overall educational problems that we have today.
You and all the candidates for the 8th Congressional District say you want to cut spending and cut the deficit. You'd probably be hard-pressed to find people who would disagree with you. That's a good idea, but a lot of people have tried and failed. You mentioned one proposal just a moment ago that didn't reach fruition. How do you get that done?
Well, I think that we have to address it from a fiscally responsible position. Now, getting that done in Washington, D.C. is going to be a tough road to hoe. I agree with you there. I don't think that there's one pill that's going to solve this problem. I think that most Americans realize that it's not an easy problem to solve. But I think that we need to change the way that we address issues in Washington, D.C., the way that we address problems in our community, and that government necessarily isn't the solution to all the problems. How do we get to a more fiscally responsible government that requires some fiscal discipline on our side? And we need to we need to tackle problems like Social Security as one, where that's entitlement spending. Right now, Social Security is 20% of our mandatory federal budget, where we have to, by law, spend that money. in 20 or 30 years, that's going to be 100% of our budget. If we don't address that now, make the hard choices that we need to do, that we need our elected officials to do, we're going to be insolvent. And I think that if that is just one example of making hard choices and coming up with solutions to solve those problems. So again, I think that as far as a one pill solution, there isn't one, but we need to start standing on those conservative principles, and that'll help us solve our problems that we face.
You mentioned